Hi everyone, this is Tamara, your courtroom companion. And for those of you who are new to my channel, thank you for stopping by. I hope you enjoy the content you find on this channel. And if you haven't yet hit the subscribe button, please do that. Also hit the bell notification so you can be notified when I upload my bi-monthly videos. So in this video, we're going to answer the question, should you include phone calls in your court order if you are a co-parent of someone that is a narcissist? So if the other parent of your children is a narcissist, I'm going to give you some things to think about, things to consider before you fight for or fight against having phone calls with that parent during your access time. So we're going to answer that question today, or at least help you to decide whether or not it's a good idea in your circumstance. And everybody's situation is a little different, but I want to give you some concrete things to think about and consider before you move in that direction. I'm going to give you sort of the one pro that you might want to think about, and it's really a questionable pro, whether or not it's a good idea in your case. So the only pro that I actually see in including phone calls in your court order is to keep the children connected in some way to the other parent during your access time. Now, that could be both good and bad. That's why it's kind of questionable whether it's a good idea or not to keep that parent connected to the children. If you are in the middle of a case and you don't yet have a court order, you might want to keep your child connected to that other parent, and you might want to fight for that if you think that that parent is healthy and you think it's a good idea to do so. But if the other parent's a narcissist, you'll want to consider some other things before you decide whether or not that's a good idea. The first thing to consider is, what would be the purpose of that phone call? Is that purpose to be one where the parent just gets to check in with the child, or the child gets to tell the other parent about their day? What is the purpose that you're kind of going after, or that other parent wants for that phone call? Now, I have heard from others in our community where that phone call was used. The purpose of it was really, although it wasn't stated in some of the court orders, the purpose is really to just do like a quick check-in. But I've heard from others in our community where it was used to sort of assert some kind of legal custody issue. So for example, if you have a parent who has religious custody, and I've seen this before where the legal custody was split. So, one parent had education and the other parent had religion and medical, or some combination of that. And so if that other parent has religious custody, they might try to use that nightly phone call to kind of force religion, maybe by doing Bible studies or prayers or anything like that. And that's not to say that that's a bad thing, but if you see it being used in that way, that other parent is kind of attempting really to take away your nightly routine with the children. Perhaps maybe you don't agree with, what he or she is teaching your child, or perhaps, you want to use your bedtime to do story time or Bible studies. And so you have to just be very careful if you're going to include this in your court order to kind of specify the purpose so that you can avoid that. And in some situations, you will have influence over your court order. In my own case, there were times when I got to see a draft of the order before it was signed and, made into a final document that we had to live by. In other cases, I wasn't able to see the draft, and the judge just drafted whatever order it was. And so if you have influence into the final court order, or even a temporary court order, be sure that you put what the purpose is. The next thing to consider is the age of the child. So if you have little ones, like maybe under, 8 years old, they have a really short attention span, and the younger they are, the shorter the attention span. And so requiring that child to participate in a phone call for any length of time might be hard. So in the court order that you're having influence over, perhaps you might want to say what the length of the call should be or should not be. Now, sometimes it's not good to include any length of time, because if you put that it's a 5-minute phone call, then the other parent's going to hold you to 5 minutes. Where what if the child doesn't want to talk for 5 minutes or wants to talk longer? So it's really hard to really specify a time. But if you have little ones, you might want to talk with your attorney about whether or not to include the timing or the length or frequency of even the call. So it's 3 times a week. Is it between this time and this time? So the age of the child is really important to determining how often the call should take place and how long it should take place. So the frequency and duration is really something you need to consider. One other thing to consider in terms of the frequency and the time is also the day. So let's say, for example, your court order says Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 7 to 8. During that hour, the other parent is entitled to call the child that when you have access. Well, what happens if you have a special event? What happens if the child is sick? What happens if you're on the road in traffic and can't make it home? So there are all these things that you need to consider, and they're all really important when you're dealing with a narcissistic parent, because whatever it says in there in the court order, they won't care if there is extenuating circumstances. They will shoot you all kind of nasty grams if you don't follow through on what that court order says. And if it says between the hours of 7 and 8, he will see that as he gets to talk to him for a whole hour. So you got to be really careful how you word it in the court order. Another thing to consider is if you include phone calls in your court order, there could be a provision in there about what happens if the other parent doesn't answer. So if the court order says the child will call the parent or the parent will call the child, what happens if either party doesn't answer? Does that mean that the phone call doesn't happen? Or does it mean that as long as the other party, whoever wasn't available, calls back within that hour, do they get that phone call? So if you're going to include the phone calls, make sure you put in there what will happen if one party doesn't answer during the specific time. Another thing to consider is whether or not it will be FaceTime or some other video chat, or whether it will be an actual phone call. There's good and bad to both of those. The problem with doing a video chat is that there really isn't a lot of privacy for either party, because whoever's in the house on either side is going to hear that conversation. So the child might feel uncomfortable if they know that everyone in the house is listening on the other side, and vice versa. The other parent might feel uncomfortable if everyone in the other parent's household is, if the child is with one parent, that household gets to hear the phone call, and on the other side, it's the same way. So there's not a lot of privacy. The other problem with FaceTime is with a narcissistic parent, they often will use the FaceTime video chat as a way to collect data about your home. And I've had this experience in my own situation where it was told to a magistrate that I was never at home with my child, that I had him out at all different places, and I was mortified because that's not true. And come to find out, he was using the background in my house to say that I wasn't home, but he's never been inside of my home, so there's no way he could know whether I was home or not, because he'd never been inside to see the contents or the decorating or anything in my house. So he was just making it up. So be careful if you use FaceTime that you not, I guess, allow the other parent to see so much of your home. With a phone call, the drawback to that is that you're only seeing your child's reaction to, or hearing your child's reaction to what's going on. So there's good and bad with both FaceTime and the phone. But the important thing is to specify in the court document whether it's phone or FaceTime, or either is fine. So just be careful of that. Another thing to consider is if phone calls are included in your court order, that you pay real close attention to the reaction that your children are having to these phone calls. If it seems to be that a negative reaction every time they talk to the other parent, you might want to consider speaking with your attorney about doing some kind of modification to that. But that's really hard to do once it's already in a court order, because you really can't go back for a modification of custody unless there's some significant change in circumstance. Now, if it's a visceral reaction, if the child is really, um, having a lot of anxiety or crying or acting out leading up to the call or after, that might be enough to warrant going back to court. But that's definitely something you'll want to talk to your attorney about. Another thing to consider on whether or not phone calls should be included or excluded from your court order is what happens if one parent or the other cannot make the phone call happen. Let's say the child is spending the night at a friend's house, or the parent has to work and has to get a babysitter for that particular time frame. You'll want to make sure that that information or a provision is put into your court order that, say, for example, the phone call will happen the next evening, or the next morning or something like that, that if a parent or the child is not able to make the phone call, that there will be a provision in there for when it will happen or when the makeup call will take place. One thing that you can do also, if you're going to include phone calls in your court order, is to, if you're not able to make a call, for example, that you could, if you know in advance that you're not going to be able to make the call, that you can try to work it out with that other parent ahead of time, like having the phone call at 4 instead of 7 o'clock, because at 7 you're not going to be able to have the child call the other parent. Now, with all of that said, I have found in my own experience that when you put too much information into the court order, whether it be about phone calls or any other issue, the more information you include, it can sometimes backfire in that there's too much information and therefore there's confusion. So what I would recommend is that phone calls not be included, because there's no way to ensure that you've accounted for every possible scenario that could occur. And when you don't follow the court order, let's say there's 10 provisions in there about phone calls. It's the date, the days, the frequency, the length, whether it's FaceTime or phone, you put all that stuff in there, and you don't do all of those things, you really have boxed yourself into a really bad corner. So instead, what I would recommend is to let the child determine when the phone calls happen. Now, obviously, that can't happen with much younger children, but much younger children don't like talking on the phone anyway. But when they get up into adolescence, say, 10, 11, 12 and older, let their desire to speak to the other parent kind of drive that, whether or not the phone calls take place. Now, I realize there might be some negative reactions to me saying that to some folks in our community because of what's happened in your unique situation. And I realize that there are extenuating circumstances where that might not be doable. But I'm just saying, in general, the child and their desire to speak with the other parent should sort of drive how often that they speak to the other to their other parent. Now, the other parent, knowing that, might try to put the child up to calling more frequently than they normally do. And you'll need to definitely pay attention to that, because narcissists are famous for using their children for their own gain. So be mindful of that. But a good rule of thumb is to let their desire to speak to the other parent drive how often and how frequent, how long that they speak to the other parent. And the older they get, the longer they might be able to have those kinds of conversations. Because here's the thing, as a parent who is healthy, you want to do what's in your child's best interest. And if that child desires to speak to the other parent and you deny that, they're just going to resent you later. So do what's in the child's best interest. And as long as you put the child's best interest above your dislike for the other parent or your hate for the other parent or your own sort of not selfish, but your own desires, if you put the child's desires above your own, you'll always be okay. let that be the driving force, what is in your child's best interest. And if your child wants to talk to the other parent, whether you like that other parent or not, it doesn't really matter. The child still wants to have a relationship with the other parent, generally. Sometimes narcissists kind of push their kids away, and I realize that can happen. But in general, it's good to let the child sort of say when they want to talk to the other parent. If you decide to include phone calls in your court order and you have influence over that, my advice is to make sure that you and your attorney carefully word whatever you put around phone calls. Make sure it's worded so that there are no loopholes, even though narcissists are famous for finding loopholes that most of us can't find. But do your best to word it very carefully so that there aren't loopholes. I'm going to include in the video card above a video I did about the 10 ways to lose a custody case. I think if you watch that video in conjunction with this one, you'll be on a good path to ensuring that whichever way you decide to go with your phone calls in your court order, that you'll be on solid footing because you're putting your children's interest above your own. I hope you found this video helpful. If you included or excluded phone calls in your court order, our community would love to hear about your experiences with it, what worked, what didn't work, maybe what you thought would work and backfired. All of us are in the same boat, and we enjoy learning from each other. So please do put some comments below or even questions that you might have, and I'll answer them. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.